Good afternoon, students, or good evening, depending on when you're watching this. This lecture is lecture 9. This will conclude the lectures on a refutation of moral relativism. I will be lecturing on both interviews 10 and 11 here, and I think we'll get through these fairly quickly. Interview 11 I'm not going to spend much time on because we're going to discuss a lot of the content of interview number 11 at the end of our next book when we discuss the vice of lust. So I'll save most of what I want to say on sexual issues for the last chapter of Glittering Vices. Okay, so in interview number 10, Isa is talking about the philosophical assumptions of absolutism. And it's very important right from the bat that you realize the following. You might agree with Isa on the truth of moral absolutism. So you might have already been a moral absolutist before you read this book. I hope if that's the case that you understand the position better, you understand the implications of the position better, and you also understand arguments against it better. Perhaps you weren't a moral absolutist or a moral relativist. You hadn't really considered either position, and now maybe you're a moral absolutist. Or maybe you're not convinced either way. Regardless, you can agree with Isa about moral absolutism being true, and you could disagree with Isa about the philosophical assumptions of absolutism. So I do disagree with him about some of those philosophical assumptions. I might mention one or two of them if I think it's necessary. But even if I don't, there's disagreement over what the philosophical assumptions of absolutism actually are. Nevertheless, you can still be an absolutist. And I don't know if I've mentioned this already, but almost all philosophers throughout history and contemporary thinkers, contemporary philosophers, almost all of them are moral absolutists. So, and nevertheless, many, perhaps most of them would disagree with Isa on one, two, three of the philosophical assumptions of absolutism. Similarly, you can disagree with Isa's analysis of the causes of moral relativism that he gives in interview 11 and still be a moral absolutist. So nothing that has gone on prior to interviews 10 and 11 are substantially affected if you disagree with some or even much of what Isa has to say in interviews 10 and 11. So that's very important. I hope you understand that, and I'll try to illustrate that maybe once or twice throughout this lecture. Okay, so Isa, right at the beginning, wants to talk about this notion that ethics rests on metaphysics, and this is a very Aristotelian, Thomistic, that is Thomas Aquinas. It's a position that has been prevalent throughout Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and it's also prevalent amongst many atheists that ethics rests on metaphysics. That is, what ought to be rests on what is. And so the idea here is that what we as humans ought to do, what we're supposed to do in any given situation, what kind of life we're supposed to live, depends upon the kind of being we are. So, for example, a good rabbit is going to exhibit characteristics and live a life quite differently from a good frog. And a good frog is going to exhibit characteristics, have features, qualities, behaviors that are quite different from a good human. And a good pen is going to exhibit features that are quite different from a good human, and a good heart, and so on and so forth. So the goodness of a thing, we might say, the goodness of a thing depends on the nature of that thing. What sort of thing It is. So, a good watch is one that tells time accurately and is wearable and so on and so forth. Um, those features are not present for pens or hearts or eyes. So, the goodness of a thing depends on the nature of that thing. And so, ICE is going to uh, sort of use that main idea to then discuss a bunch of other different issues. So he's going to connect ethics with knowledge. He's going to connect ethics with, skepticism that's connected to knowledge. He's going to connect ethics to all these other positions. I'll go through some of those very quickly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because I think there's a main general argument that is given in interview number 10 that is very important and interesting. And that general argument is independent of the specific sort of features that ISA brings up in interview number 10. Okay, so for example, ISA says that you, moral absolutism rules out rules out skepticism. Right, so the idea here is that moral absolutism, if it's true, and he thinks that it is, he thinks he's given you excellent reasons for you to believe that moral absolutism is true. He thinks that that then implies that skepticism is false. So if moral absolutism is true, then it's possible for us to know things. Okay. Now, he doesn't really, I don't think, give very good reasons for this or give much of an argument for this, but it's not super hard to see. So I'm going to give you some reasons for thinking that ISA is correct here. Namely, that if moral absolutism is true, then skepticism is false. Or putting it differently, if moral absolutism is true, then we can in fact know things. Okay. So the idea is this, that look, if moral absolutism is true, think about it along these lines. If moral absolutism is true, and nevertheless we can't know that moral absolutism is true, or we can't know certain moral truths, like murder is wrong, stealing is wrong, rape is wrong, genocide is wrong, then that's going to end up undermining moral absolutism. And the main reason why is this: if it's not possible for me to know that murder is wrong, rape is wrong, terrorism is wrong, genocide is wrong, if it's not possible for us to know that, then it seems like the following is true. Then I cannot be held responsible for not knowing it. So I can't be held responsible, for example, for not knowing that murder is wrong because it's impossible to know that murder is wrong. So then I can't be held responsible for not knowing it since it's impossible to know it. And if I can't be held responsible for not knowing that murder is wrong, then if I commit murder, I have a good defense, right? I can say that I didn't know it was wrong. I can't know that it's wrong. So committing murder is not wrong. It's not, or at the very least, if it's wrong, I'm not guilty of anything. I haven't done anything that I'm morally responsible for doing. And if it's not possible for me to be morally responsible in doing any action, then any action is permissible for me to do. Any action is okay for me to perform since I can't be held responsible for performing any action. And as I said in the previous lecture, it is an essential feature of morality that morality says an essential feature of morality is that there are certain actions that are simply not permissible to perform. So if there is such a thing as morality, then there are types of actions that are not permitted. There are types of actions that are not permissible at all, no matter the circumstance, no matter the intention, no matter the heart, no matter anything like that. If there is such a thing as morality, then there are types of actions that are not permissible. That was one of the arguments that I gave you. But if skepticism is true, that we can't know anything, then that's going to be false. There will be no type of action that is impermissible, or at the very least, there'll be no type of action that I can be held responsible for performing, that I could be guilty or have done something morally wrong in doing it. So it does look like moral absolutism implies that it's possible to know various things. It's possible to know that moral absolutism is true. It's possible to know various moral claims. And so moral absolutism does, it seems, imply that skepticism is false. Knowledge is possible if moral absolutism is true, and indeed moral knowledge is possible if moral absolutism is true. Okay, Isa then, he gives a general argument against skepticism. This is probably worth you hearing just simply because these types of arguments are very important. You can apply these to a ton of different scenarios. So he says, let's consider sort of general skepticism. General skepticism is the idea that knowledge is not possible. Well, almost everyone thinks that there's something self-referentially absurd about the claim that knowledge is not possible, and here's why. Because the person who says knowledge is not possible, you want to ask, well, do you know that knowledge is not possible? And if they say, yes, I know knowledge is not possible, then they've refuted themselves, because they then know something, right? Namely, that knowledge is not possible, and so the claim that knowledge is not possible is false, right? Because they actually know something. If they say, no, I don't know it, I don't know that knowledge is not possible, I just think it is, well, then you're justified. You should ask them, well, what reasons do you have for thinking that knowledge is not possible? Even if you don't know it, why do you think that it's true that knowledge is not possible? And then for any reason they give, you can ask of that reason, well, do you know that reason? If they say, nope, I don't know it, well, then you can legitimately say, well, you haven't given me a reason to believe that reason. I need some reasons to believe those reasons for the claim that knowledge is not possible, and so on down the line. So if the claim is knowledge is not possible, and the person claims to know it, then they've undermined the claim that knowledge is not possible, and so general skepticism is false. If the claim is that knowledge is not possible, but I don't know that knowledge is not possible, then we have no good reason to believe that knowledge is not possible, and so once again, general skepticism, there's no reason to believe it. So general skepticism is either self-referentially absurd or completely unjustified. That's the idea. So Isa thinks that you've got good reasons to believe that skepticism, that is the idea that knowledge is not possible, he thinks you've got excellent reasons to think that it's false. Namely, moral absolutism implies that knowledge is possible, and the claim that knowledge is not possible is all by itself either self-referentially absurd or impossible to give justification for it, to give good reasons for it. Okay, I'm going to skip a bunch of other stuff, and I'm just going to talk about some of the other assumptions that Isa gives of moral absolutism. He says moral absolutism implies anti-materialism, and by that he means the idea that humans are both material and non-material beings. That is, humans are both bodies and souls. He thinks that's implied by moral absolutism. I'm not so sure about that. That's not obvious to me. There are a number of thinkers, Christian and non-Christian, who think that we really are just bodies, that we don't have immaterial souls, or at the very least, we don't have immaterial souls in a particular sense, and I suspect it's the sense that Isa is assuming here. So it's not obvious to me that anti-materialism, in the sense that Isa is suggesting, is an assumption of moral absolutism. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I would need to hear more arguments for that, and I think you would need to as well. He says that moral absolutism implies anti-determinism. And I think, once again, that this is not quite right. This is only true maybe for one form of determinism, namely what we might call physical determinism. But it's not obvious to me that moral absolutism implies that all determinisms are false. So There's physical determinism, or maybe what we could call causal determinism, and that's the idea that the state of the physical universe determines the state of the physical universe at any given time determines the state of the physical universe at all other times. That may very well imply that moral absolutism is false, but there are other kinds of determinisms. Name one that I'm most interested in is called theological determinism, and it's the idea that even though physical states don't determine other physical states, God determines all the states of the universe and the states of the individuals in that universe, and nevertheless, moral absolutism is true. If you're interested in that, I have a recent book that I published. If you that I'd love for you to purchase and read. You can contact me about that. He says moral absolutism implies anti-behaviorism, anti-pantheism. It implies essentialism. It implies God's existence. He thinks moral absolutism implies God's existence. I'm very much interested in that claim. I'm very much interested in the idea that morality implies God. I actually do think that there's excellent arguments for that claim. I've also written on that, and I have a different book that I wrote that argues for that claim. If you're interested in that, contact me. However, and this is really, really important, the claim that moral absolutism implies God's existence does not suggest that atheists can't be moral absolutists, or atheists can't do decent, good, right things. Okay, so what the claim, so the idea is that moral absolutism, the philosophical doctrine, the philosophical theory called moral absolutism, Isa is claiming, and I do agree with this, that it implies God's existence. Okay, but you can affirm moral absolutism and just simply not see that it implies God's existence, or you could affirm moral absolutism and deny God's existence, in which case you would just be wrong, right? You'd be making a mistake in thinking that you could be a moral absolutist and an atheist. Similarly, atheists, there's nothing that Isa says here, and there's no good reason to think that atheists can't do decent things. They can help old people cross the street. They can donate their money to charity, even for obviously selfish reasons. They can sacrifice their life for strangers, and so on and so forth. What it does mean is that the atheist is just deeply inconsistent. Okay, and so Isa is pointing out that in order to be consistent, that is, to have all of our beliefs line up properly, to have our mind conform to the way the world is, to have our actions and our beliefs integrated, to have integrity, Isa does think, right, that you need to reject materialism, determinism, behaviorism, pantheism, atheism, and whatnot. And I definitely think he's right on the atheist account, on the atheism account. Okay. So now, as I said, right, I disagree with some of Isa's claims about the philosophical assumptions of moral absolutism, but nevertheless, there's a general argument that we should discern here. And so let's call this the general argument of interview 10. And this general argument, I think, is really, really interesting and fascinating and good. Okay, general argument of interview 10, step 1. If blank, I'll talk about that blank in a minute. If blank is true, then there is no such thing as morality. 2. But there is such a thing as morality. 3. Hence, blank is false. Okay, so let's look at that again. Step 1. If blank is true, then there's no such thing as morality. So Isa thinks that what goes in that blank are things like materialism. So if materialism, the idea that we're just bodies, if materialism is true, then there's no such thing as morality. I'm not so sure about that. He thinks if determinism is true, then there's no such thing as morality. I think that's probably true on one kind of determinism, maybe not on another. He says if atheism is true, then there's no such thing as morality. If so that is, if God does not exist, then there's no such thing as morality. I think he's right on that account. So, but regardless, the way that I've stated step one in the argument is whatever correctly goes in that blank, right? If blank is true, then there's no such thing as morality. There are certain things that go in the blank. I think atheism goes in the blank, that is, God does not exist. I think if that's true, there's no such thing as morality. Isa thinks determinism and other things. You get the idea. So step one looks pretty good to me. If blank is true, then there's no such thing as morality. Step two, but there is such a thing as morality. Now, Isa thinks that you should believe that, right? Because he thinks that he's demonstrated moral absolutism. If you don't think he's demonstrated it yet, I'd love to hear from you as to why you don't. But let's pretend for a second, just for the sake of argument, if you don't think he's demonstrated that there's such a thing as morality, just pretend for a second. So step two says, but there is such a thing as morality, from which it follows, step three, hence, whatever goes in that blank has to be false. Okay, that just follows. So if there is such a thing as morality, then anything that is incompatible with there being such a thing as morality has to be false. Okay, and so this is a perfectly legitimate argument. This is a really good argument. It's a good argument form. So for example, if I tell you that some theory implies that you do not really exist, that there's no such being as Martha or Jan or Frank or Greg or David, if there's some theory that implies that I don't exist or that you don't exist, then that's a good reason to reject that theory, right? That theory has a really, really, really absurd implication, namely that I don't exist. I do exist. So any theory that implies my non-existence is a bad theory. Here's one, right? Buddhism actually implies the non-existence of selves, and so that's a fairly powerful reason to be concerned about Buddhism. Okay, so similarly, if a theory implies that there's no such thing as morality, then Isa thinks you should reject that theory because you know there is such a thing as morality. You already know it's false, or you should know it's false. You know that there's such a thing as morality. You probably knew it. Maybe you knew it before you read the book. Isa thinks you should definitely know it now. And so whatever there is that implies there's no such thing as morality is false. Okay. So I'm gonna just let that be interview 10. Okay, now we're gonna move on to interview 11. I'm gonna be real quick here. What we're doing in interview 11, what ICE is doing in interview 11 is he's looking at the causes and cures of relativism. And ICE says a lot of fascinating things here that when I first read it, to be honest, I was not persuaded, and I thought Isa maybe was just exaggerating things. I thought he was making some interesting points worthy of further reflection, but I thought maybe he was being a bit hyperbolic. Upon, years of thinking about this, I'm becoming more and more convinced that he's on the right track here. Okay, so he thinks the a very general way to look at the causes of moral relativism, why moral relativism seems to be on the rise in the West, and then because of the influence of the West throughout the world. In general, he thinks we have a loss of the four cardinal virtues. So the four cardinal virtues are important for you to know, and those cardinal virtues are wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. Now, wisdom here is usually talked about as practical wisdom. Now, my understanding, my reading of Aristotle is that Aristotle actually thinks the wisdom here is both what's called practical and theoretical wisdom. But we can ignore that for now. The four cardinal virtues, again, are wisdom, courage, temperance or self-control, and justice. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go over those Practical wisdom or wisdom is knowing the moral truth that is to be done, knowing the right thing that is to be done at the right time, in the right situation, towards the right person. The person who has that kind of wisdom, or the person who knows those things, this is the thing to be done, when to be done, where to be done, to whom it's to be done, that person has practical wisdom. Um, Real quick story. I highly recommend that you Google Radio Lab and then Heroes, and then listen to that Radio Lab on Heroes. It's an unbelievable, incredible, incredible, very short, I think it's like 20, 30 minutes long, story of various heroes in our culture. And one of them, the last one, I'm not going to go into detail because I'd love for you to listen to it. In fact, if you listen to it, I'll let you write up a reading review for it. Um, but the very last one, they interview the guy either in the Radio Lab or maybe they interviewed him in some different thing that I did a little bit of research on. But they interview the man and they ask him. They said, do you think you're a hero? Do you regard yourself as a hero? And he says, no, of course not. I just did. I didn't even think about what I did. I just did it. Now, he thinks that the fact that he did it without thinking, he did it unhesitatingly, he did it unreflectively, he thinks that that's almost a defect of his action, right? That doesn't mean he should be praised and worthy of great honor. Where in fact, in the tradition of moral philosophy, that feature of his, given a few other conditions, that feature of his that he did it without thinking unhesitatingly, is actually makes his action even better, because what it suggests is that he's the kind of person who just automatically knows what is to be done in a situation and he does it. Whereas for me, in the situation that he's in, I would probably, almost guaranteed, I would have hesitated and it would have resulted in disaster. So, so practical wisdom, when you have it, and we'll talk about this in the next book, when you have the virtue of wisdom, of practical wisdom, when you really have it, it's just a part of who you are. Courage. Courage is, the way Isa puts it, is choosing the good or the right thing, even when it may hurt. Um, Courage has to do with, doing what is called for, doing what you're supposed to do, even in the face of danger, even in the face of external or even internal threats. Self-control, that has to do with ruling our passions, our appetites. Right? So it's ruling our appetites, our passions, our bodily appetites, our palates. We're going to talk about this when we talk about gluttony and when we talk about lust. So I'll go more into that later. Justice, the way Isa puts it, is the way Plato puts it. It's when each of the parts of the soul are functioning as they're supposed to function, or applied to the political sphere, it's when each of the various sectors of the body politic are functioning as they're supposed to be. So justice is kind of a description of a well-ordered soul, a well-ordered person, or a well-ordered society. Those would be just persons and just societies. Okay, so Isa thinks then when we look at the West, what we see is the following. He thinks that uh, the sexual revolution has undermined each of those cardinal virtues. So we no longer know what we're supposed to do when it comes to sexual relations. We no longer have the courage to do what we're supposed to do when it comes to various sexual activities. We've lost control when it comes to various sexual activities. And so therefore then the various parts of our lives and the various parts of society are no longer functioning as they're supposed to, and we live in a deeply unjust society. So Isa thinks really at the bottom of moral relativism is sex, is this laxity, this kind of liberalism with respect to sex. And by liberalism, I'm not talking about necessarily political liberals. What I'm talking about is a kind of loosening of our understanding of the importance of sex. And again, I'm going to talk about this a lot more when we get to the lust section. I'll just say a couple of things here that I think were interesting. I thought it was fascinating that Isa talked about how abortion really is about sex. And in many cases, not all cases, certainly not all cases, abortion is about a kind of birth control. Um, at least it's a kind of birth control, of course, in all cases, right? All cases of elective abortion, that is intentional abortion, are a kind of birth control. Um, Now, one thing that's really important that ISA doesn't talk about, but I want to talk about, is this. When we say that, Steve has done something wrong, it does not follow that Steve. Let me put it like this. If I say that Steve has done something wrong and Fred did the exact same thing as Steve, then it's going to follow that Fred did something wrong. But what doesn't follow is the level of moral responsibility or moral blame or moral guilt that is attributed to Steve and Fred. So if Steve does something wrong and Fred did the same thing as Steve, then Fred did something wrong. If Steve is guilty to degree 10, let's say, it does not follow that Fred is guilty to the same degree. Let me give you a case in point. Suppose Martha is married to uh, uh, Bob, and Bob is from the day they were married, maybe prior to their marriage, Bob was really sweet and kind. He was charming, generous, loving, and so on and so forth. But as soon as they're married, Bob becomes this monster. Bob beats Martha. Bob cheats on Martha. He rapes Martha. I mean, he is just a monster in their marriage. And after 10 years of enduring this, Martha has an affair. Martha cheats on Steve. Or Bob, whoever's name I was using. Okay, so you got the Martha Bob case in your head. Now let's consider the Susie Frank case. Susie's married to Frank. Susie and Frank have a decent marriage. Frank's like a normal husband. He loves Susie. He cares for her. He provides. He makes some mistakes. He's done some certain things wrong. Blah blah blah. But he's nowhere near Bob. And one day, after 10 years of marriage, Susie cheats on uh, Steve or Frank or whoever's name I was using. Sorry. Okay, so you got the two different scenarios in your head, I hope, right? So we've got Martha, and we've got Susie. Martha and Susie have performed, in a sense, the same action. They've performed adultery. But Martha's performance of adultery and so let's say adultery is wrong. Martha's performance of adultery and Susie's performance of adultery are quite different performances. So both have done something morally wrong. But the level of moral responsibility and guilt that is attributable to both of them is different, or to each of them is different. Okay. If you don't like that example, come up with an example of your own. You see the idea here. And so now let's go back to the abortion case. So there are some women who've performed abortions, let's say, because they wanted to go on vacation to the beach and their pregnancy was going to make them look, less attractive, let's say. And so they had an abortion so that they could go to the beach. And there are some women who've had an abortion because they were raped, or because of incest, or because the financial situation. They're extremely poor. There's no family to help, and so on and so forth. So even if it's true, let's pretend it's true that abortion is wrong. The level of moral responsibility and guilt that is attributable to the women who perform abortion may very well differ, and in some cases maybe the person who has an abortion isn't even guilty in any way, even though the act of abortion is a morally wrong act. Okay, so there's lots of fascinating issues here that we can explore, and we'll explore some of those in a bit more detail when we get to the next book. Um, the 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 last thing to say here about this, the sexual, the emphasis on sex is, and I'll talk about this again with lust, is what Isa is doing is Isa is looking at sex and he's noticing the power of sex. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Rob Bell. I'm not a big fan of Rob Bell's writing or his theology, but he has this series that was called the Pneuma series, and I highly recommend his video on sex. He talks about in that video how sex, he compares it to a fire. I think I can't remember who. I think maybe Augustine actually was one of the first persons to compare sex to fire. That it's wonderful, fire is awesome, it's necessary for fuel and for our continued sustainment, our continued existence, but it's also very dangerous. And so Isa's point is that what we've done with sex is we've completely eliminated the sacredness of it, the importance of it. And thereby we've eliminated the beauty of it. We've eliminated the wonder, the goodness of it. Um, so Isa also, and I'll talk about this more in the video on lust. Isa also wants to say that there's some fascinating connections between sex uh, and our relationship with God. And Scripture, the Bible, certainly portrays, certainly gives us good reasons to think that there are fascinating relationships between sex and our relationship with God, our relationship with Christ. So we'll talk about more of that later. For now, I think I'll end it.